It is 15 after 3 a.m. This is Shayla standing in for Chaba G on Living Redefined, and we're chatting all things dealing with loneliness during the festive season. Now, the holiday season is generally thought of as a time of joy and love and family and social engagements and the likes. However, for many people, it is a time of loneliness. Now, helping us further understand this is the likes of Daniel Hollander, who is a clinical psychologist and is on the line this afternoon. Good afternoon to you, Dan.
Thank you for having me on the show, Shayla.
I am really excited to be having this conversation because I feel like this is one of those taboo topics. You know, I feel as though the festive season, everybody's echoing family togetherness. Everybody's saying, let's get together. How do people experience loneliness during that time?
Well, we know, for example, during the Christmas periods that usually that's also a time where psychologists are incredibly busy. And I think a lot of it's got to do with the fact of expectations. And sometimes, life can get very difficult. And I know that we, especially with COVID, have been dealing a lot with bereavements and the loss of people that are close by. And what usually would be a festive and a family get-together now suddenly isn't, and is another remembrance of loss. That can be one reason. And another reason can be that sometimes, especially if it's been a difficult year as we've had as South Africans with the economy playing havoc on us and recession, that expectations that maybe our kids have or maybe we have of providing a certain type of Christmas isn't available anymore, and it can start to make us feel inadequate or even as if we're not quite making the standards. And I think that can have such a difficult effect on people during this Christmas period.
Wow. I read in an article and it had stated that sometimes it's already a pre-existing feeling. So loneliness and isolation has already been there. However, during the year, you had been so busy with work and life and trying to get yourself into a space where you feel sort of like you're moving and progressing in life. However, once it hits the festive season, you're given that time to breathe because there's no work. There's no distraction, so to speak. How would you then reckon that one is to deal with that kind of trauma?
I think in a big extent, it's got to do with being careful in regards to, especially when we hold expectations of ourselves and of what is necessary. I think often it's very easy for us to be kind to other people. We often forget to be kind towards ourselves.
Sure.
And I think often we, and probably a lot to do with things like financial goals and there's an old saying that says being a father is having photos where money used to be. Family life is expensive, and it throws a huge curveball at us in regards to goals and expectations. And I think we've got to be careful a little bit around what we expect. And I think also in light of that, is you're actually quite right. And I think the lockdown has taught us that more than anything else. I speak from my own experience as well, before lockdown, I think my work ethic was probably a little bit out of control, and lockdown taught me tone down a little bit, stay home a little bit more. But I think that for a lot of people, if that only comes around at Christmas time, we get a sense of also what the sacrifice sometimes is. If both parents are working, or the sacrifice is when we have to almost work 2 or 3 jobs, as we know that a lot of South Africans do. And we miss out on that family connection and the family contact. And what I also just add is that it's a difficult thing about relationships, is that the relationship is something that you got to keep moving at. And I think a lot of us have got a terrible work-life balance, and usually not even our choice. Usually our employers are threatening us if we don't work overtime. And when we get to Christmas, we're suddenly faced with our kids and with our families. But often at that point in time, we realize what we're losing with that work-life balance not in place.
My goodness, you raised such important points. I've got so many questions. So let's start with the work and personal life balance, right? I think the one thing that Christmas and this festive season altogether appears to be as a time of reconciliation. So if you were fighting with your brother throughout the year, you need to get together in the same place. So you're going to sort of forge this relationship and sort of get to this place where you are introducing toxic positivity. How do we curb that?
Yeah, I think there's something to be said about that. I once heard a previous interview on SAfm where they were talking about is blood thicker than water, and one of the beautiful quotes from that was somebody saying that his opinion about blood and water is that blood tends to murky the water,
Wow.
which I thought was a great quote. Because I think that's also something that we've learned in lockdown as well. Sorry, I'm comparing lockdown a bit with the Christmas festive period, but some relationships are not healthy. And we know that, for example, in toxic relationships, that often there are toxic relationships in family setups. And in Christmas time, we're now supposed to all be happy and all together, and sometimes that gets manipulated. So that you have to almost pretend as if everything is okay with somebody who's actually abusing you or causing trauma in your household, or has got an alcohol problem, and that comes out in the festive period, and so suddenly you're forced to have to pretend as if what's not normal is suddenly normal, and that plays a role into that as well. Because that can become extremely traumatizing, is when a victim of abuse is being socially pressurized to act as if everything is normal.
You had mentioned quite a number of things, and I think it is fair for you to compare the lockdown period, because that is what we're currently facing. You said something about being good to yourself. Now, that's a proactive way to move out of toxicity altogether. How does one practically apply this, especially in this context?
I think it's interesting you asked the question, because on my own personal journey, I actually come from a different country and a different culture, but I've lived in South Africa pretty much all my life. And yes. I've got a whole bunch of different traditions and cultures that we're supposed to be doing around the Christmas period, except that one of those, which was part of my previous culture, is actually something that I on an ethical basis can't do anymore. So my family and myself are in this beautiful process of redefining our own traditions around Christmas to something that's more meaningful. What I mean with that is, especially when it has to do with things like, for example, the material aspects of Christmas,
yes,
and the consumerism of Christmas. I think to an extent is to say that that's a decision, but you don't have to have Christmas that way. In my family, we make sure that it has to be one thing that's useful, one thing for school in the next year, one piece of clothing. And that's already more than enough presents.
Yes.
and keep it small, but keep everything about Christmas about the connection. I think also, I think it's making the rounds now on Facebook, but I think it's such an important one, is be careful that you don't, especially if you're more wealthy, that you don't buy exuberant presents for your kids and then say that Santa gave it to them. Because kids talk in schools, and it just further creates that inequality that we have in our country. I think we need to be so much more. From what I was taught, Christmas was more about giving than about receiving, and I think those things are important. But alternatively, as well, is I think also in a multicultural society like South Africa. We talk more about festive seasons than rather about Christmas, and a time for family and connection, but it can also be a connection within your own self. Family doesn't have to be uncles and aunts and grandparents, and it especially if there's toxicity in that. sometimes the deepest connections that we have are very close friends, and the importance of connecting with those who are important to you. But I want to also say there should not be a pressure for you. I think if you're on the thinking of something a little bit more introverted, I think it's perfectly acceptable and perfectly healthy to choose it to do something you enjoy. I heard of somebody recently who thought, let me take that money I would have spent on Christmas and have a few days vacation in a place that I would otherwise never spend, and just be kind to myself in that way.
Wow.
So I think, we have the power to redefine these festive seasons the way we want to. And I think the important part is it's about connection, and connection to other people, but also connection to yourself. I think that becomes so important. And be active as well.
Yes.
If you've got a healthy body, you've got a healthy mind. And also with COVID, online connection, we've really changed that quite dramatically for the last 3 or 4 years. Have a lot of FaceTime in regards with family that you do want to be in contact with. Spend time. Do what it is that you want to do and that you enjoy. And be careful not to try and use this festive season to try and make other people happy. You've worked hard. It's been a rough year.
Yes.
Let this month be really about you.
Yes. I think what's really beautiful is that you spoke about bonding, not just with people, but with yourself. And I can't help but think of the people who are currently going to work, who will be working during Christmas, who will be working during New Year's and the New Year's Eve. What would you say to them? Because I believe that would be an opportunity for you to bond with yourself. What would you then sort of steer them? What direction are you steering them? I know we spoke generally about bonding with yourself, doing things that you like. But if you don't have the privilege, not financially, but in all aspects, don't have the privilege to take time off, what can you then do?
I think it is important if you plan, if you are somebody who finds the days important, to do something special on the day, even if it's a big meal out. Even if it's with 3 or 4 people, do something on the day itself. But you're right, a lot of people are working during the Christmas time. A lot of important people are working. Your essential services,
Yes.
your doctors and nurses, security, your people that we count on in order to keep the world going. The people who keeps our shops running. We always complain about the shops being closed early around the Christmas period, but we forget that that's families who are sacrificing their loved ones in order to be able to make sure that there's milk in the coffee. I mean, it is a bit ridiculous if you think about it.
Yeah.
But I think what's important is, that's something that I do as well, is that if I know that I have to work over a Christmas period, is I make sure that I do something to commemorate the times and the dates that are important to me around the Christmas period. But I also promise myself I'm going to take leave as soon as possible afterwards, and then do something important there if we have the opportunity to do so. But the reality also is that a lot of us are not in that position. A lot of us eat hand to mouth. And I think in that situation, I think sometimes it's also important for those people who are in a privileged position to be conscious of it and do something about it. That's exactly where Ubuntu comes in. Hey,
Yes.
Your humanity, my humanity is in the hands of what you do with me, and it's so important that you protect my humanity through your actions. And I think there's not enough of that happening. And then when there is some sort of community outreach, it becomes like a charity case, and that is so condescending. But I think it's got a lot to do with teaching ourselves and our community that it's literally the old saying of Christmas: it's better to give than to receive.
Wow, it's better to give than to receive. Thank you so much for your time, Dan. I know that you said that psychologists are fully booked, fully packed in the festive season, but I would appreciate it if you were to share your digital footprint so people can get a hold of you should they require your services.
I appreciate it. Yes, I am on holiday at the moment.
Yes.
I'm literally sitting with my little babaki half a
Oh,
meter away from me. But sure, no problem. You can find me. The easiest way to find me is on Instagram. If you put in those who can struggle, so those who can struggle, you'll find me there.
wow. Well, enjoy the rest of your holiday. Let us not take too much of your time.
It's always a pleasure.
That was the likes of Daniel Den Hollander, who is a clinical psychologist, chatting all things how to cope with loneliness during the festive season. I think it's about that time we get into some music. We're going to be listening to Hugh Masekela with this one titled Kauleza.